Dr. Justin Piché is an associate professor in the Department of Criminology and director of the Carceral Studies Research Collective at the University of Ottawa. Today, we talk with Dr. Justin about the government's decision to build a new 32 million prison in Fredericton. Here's what he has to say. You said the New Brunswick government does not have a business case to build a new prison in Fredericton. Can you elaborate your statement?
So I believe that the government of New Brunswick has yet to make a convincing case that it needs to build a new prison in Fredericton, and that to do so, what it needs to do is release the information from the bureaucracy and from the politicians involved in the decision to reveal what are indeed their justifications for building this new institution, when we know that imprisonment is the most costly, least effective, most unjust, and most inhumane way to respond to criminalized harms. So I think the fact that they are withholding records right now from journalists and from the public suggests that they have a weak hand. One of the justifications they have stated for building a new prison is that there is crowding and projected crowding going forward. And I think when they make such claims, it's important to look at what they were able to do during the pandemic to try and limit the number of people going in and out of institutions and limiting the amount of people that were housed in those congregate sites of human caging. In the first wave of the pandemic, the government of New Brunswick was imprisoning, I believe, 358 people at one point provincially. And that was down from pre-pandemic levels of 450 people behind bars. So they were able, within a matter of weeks, working in concert with police, with the judiciary, to be able to reduce their prison population by over 20%. And that happened fairly quickly. Based on the research that I've done around prisons in the pandemic, a lot of people were being released without supports. Now imagine if we spent money on people and building community supports instead of this prison, what we could do in terms of reducing the prison population in a way that would enhance community well-being and safety. So we know, for instance, that at a cost of $32 million, it's unclear at this point whether that's 32 million over a certain amount of years through a public-private partnership, or if they're just spending $32 million in one go. If we divide that up by 109 beds, which is what they say they want to build with this facility, that's $294,000 roughly per bed. And if the goal is to make communities safer, we should be thinking about like what is leading people to coming into conflict with the law, and how can we prevent them from being in prison in the first place. My colleague, Irvin Waller, who's now an emeritus professor here in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, spent a lifetime doing research on prevention. And he notes through his work, looking at various different studies, that the evidence suggests that for every dollar you spend upstream on prevention, you save $7 that you'd otherwise spend on police, courts, prisons, and victim services after victimization has occurred. So instead of building another facility that will have a negligible impact on violence in the community, that will also expose people living and working in those facilities to the violence of incarceration. Because no matter which side of the walls you find yourselves on, or which side of the bars, it is extremely damaging in terms of the deprivations prisoners face, that are debilitative, not rehabilitative, and the damage that workers place in terms of occupational stress and safety. So, you know, if we have $32 million, or if the government of New Brunswick has $32 million to spend on enhancing community safety in Fredericton, I would look at, well, why are people going in there? And if they're saying, for instance, one of their justifications, at least out in public, is that they have an increasing drug problem, why on earth would you go and spend more money on enforcement and incarceration when we know that the war on drugs is an absolute and utter failure? It's 2022, not 1972. We know that relying on incarceration more to address drug issues in our communities doesn't make us safer. If it did, the United States, which went on a massive imprisonment and prison building rampage during the 80s and the 90s, and further on closer to today, they would be the safest places in the world. They aren't. And a lot of that was driven by the war on drugs, and it's made their communities less safe. So if that's one of the stated justifications that the government of New Brunswick is making politically to try and sell this thing to people, I would say, okay, you got $32 million. Why don't you create harm reduction spaces with that? With $32 million at $14,500 per harm reduction space, you could create 2,200 spaces. You could offer drug treatment for 35 days with a year of aftercare at $19,000 for, you know, almost 1,700 people. Okay, so you have drug issues. Okay, why don't you go spend it there? Harm reduction, drug treatment. You could hire at $50,000 per year. You could hire peer support workers to work with people who have a shared experience and support them to get them to the other side of what they're facing. If mental health is an issue, you know, intensive case management, the cost per year for a space for mental health interventions is $13,500 per year. So you can do a lot of good with that instead of caging people. Permanent supportive housing, you know, to stop the cycle of people going from homelessness to imprisonment. You know, that costs $40,000 per year. You know, there's so much more that we could be doing to build communities, not cages, in a way that would enhance our collective well-being and safety. And what the government of New Brunswick is doing right now is a mistake, and it's costly. It will be costly, both in a financial sense as well as in a human sense. This should be a thing. Prison building should be a thing of the past, and that they would go down this path like other governments across the country that are still building cages makes absolutely no sense. So in sum, do I think they have a case to build a new prison? It's a very weak one, and I'd be happy to debate them and other proponents of imprisonment anywhere, anytime, to talk about the merits and pitfalls of what these proponents of incarceration are advancing.
So the Department of Justice told us that as of November 2nd, there were 511 adult men in custody, while the capacity is 470. This means an overcapacity of 41. What do you think about this?
Again, if they're saying they have a crowding issue, I would ask them, what were you doing during the first wave of the pandemic to limit the use of incarceration? And go back to that and see what worked and align reentry supports with that, and you'll be in a better place than wasting money, $32 million on a new provincial prison in Fredericton. So, I mean, yeah, okay, there's crowding at this moment. Within a span of weeks, they could address that by relying on temporary absences, parole, They could make investments and put directives upstream, for instance, to encourage police to use more release on recognizance, with promises to appear before court. They could, work with prosecutors to enter in more bail consent agreements with more reasonable conditions instead of laundry lists of conditions that set people up to fail. If there's a reason to do it, and there was early on in the pandemic, for a public health perspective, but I would also argue there's a public safety perspective that should lead them to be doing similar things. And these are things that can be done very quickly. Building a prison takes several years. So if they're telling me right now on November 2nd, we have 511 people in our prisons right now, and the solution to this is to build a prison that won't be open for a few years, I can get them there. I shouldn't say I can get them there. Let me go back. If the government is saying that on November 2nd, they have a crowding issue, they can dig themselves out of that quicker through investments in people and communities upstream and diverting and decarcerating people from custody. That can happen in a matter of weeks, a few months. Whereas addressing crowding through prison construction is a proposition of several years. They haven't announced a site for it that I'm aware of. So they haven't done due diligence activities, which include things like environmental assessments. They haven't put out a request for qualifications, a request for proposals. They haven't signed a contract. They haven't put shovels in the ground. They haven't built a wall.
Right.
So if crowding's the issue they want to pin this on, again, a weak argument to make, because there are other things we could be doing now, not years from now, when this proposed prison is going to open, to address this issue. So that doesn't hold to me. And when we know, again, incarceration is the most costly, least effective, most unjust, most inhumane way to deal with harm and conflict in our communities, we need to be looking at other things. And, rather than pissing away $32 million on another prison.
Right. So in an email statement to us, the Department of Justice did tell us that they are building the prison in Fredericton region, and they said that because the number of individuals being incarcerated is on the rise, therefore they believe that the new Fredericton Correctional Center will better accommodate the increase. Do you think this is the valid reason to build a new prison?
No, I mean, I've already I think my last answer responded to that question. I think if there's rising victimization, police reported victimization in a given community, and I'd have to look at the stats around that. Are they comparing numbers from 2020 to 2021 and 2022? Because if they are, there was something going on in 2020, right? Where the levels of police reported victimization were at a fairly low level. There were lockdowns for a good part of that year, right? So things, as they've opened up, of course, law breaking will increase as well. So I'd have to look at what statistics they're citing exactly, but if they're citing recent increases in comparison to what happened, say, in 2020, I think we have to take a longer view. But either way, whether victimization is going up or down, I think the important question to ask is, what will make us safer? And is building a prison going to do that? No. So, I think we have to look at investing upstream on things that will prevent victimization and that will keep people safe in the broadest sense of the term, that will keep people working, that will keep people in good health and mental health. In the context of debilitating healthcare and mental health crises, we're going to be building a prison? Like, get real.
Mhm. As someone who has studied on prison construction for like decades, like, can you tell us like how is the money spent on prison construction? Like, what goes through?
Um, yeah, I mean, in terms of where this 32 million will go, I
Yeah.
mean, it will go towards designing, building, uh, and if the government's taking out a loan for this, I'm not sure if they are, would go towards financing it and maintaining it. Now, the 32 million that they've announced so far, that's not the only cost. There's also the operational costs
Mhm.
of running that prison. So in addition to $32 million it's going to cost to design and build the new provincial prison in Fredericton that the government's proposing, there's also operational costs. So I'll use pre-pandemic numbers because the pandemic numbers actually inflated the average cost of prisoners per day. But if we go with pre-pandemic numbers, it costs them roughly $201 per day to imprison just one person in a provincial prison in New Brunswick. So if we were to times that by 109 people, if you build it, you'll fill it. That is a cost of nearly $22,000 per day just to operate that facility, to pay for staff and pay for security equipment, utilities, etc. And if we look at the yearly cost, we go from $22,000 a day to $8 million per year. And, that cost continues throughout the life of the prison in terms of how long it stays open. So there's a lot of money that the government is proposing, I'd say, to divert from other things they could be spending on to enhance community well-being and safety towards human caging. And to my mind, it's a waste of money. And the crowding issues that they're citing, the issues around increase in drug-related offenses, there are other ways to be doing things that are more effective and less costly and more just and more humane, and they should get on that.
Lastly, what are the key sectors should the New Brunswick government be focusing on to deal with crime within the province?
If the government of New Brunswick is concerned about trying to make their communities safer, they should be spending this money on education and early intervention for youth. There's a lot of kids right now that are in school that are struggling, that will face frustration at school in relation to the challenges that they are enduring, that are being met with punishment within the school settings, like detentions, suspensions, expulsions. And if we don't spend on early intervention and education, we end up creating school to prison pipelines for those people. So for those young people. So I think, you got to invest in the kids now with some of those funds. You also need to look at how you can better address people living with drug use issues, and looking at increasing harm reduction and drug treatment capacity, and also increasing mental health supports. And I think if you do that, you would have significantly fewer people behind bars. And if you tackle homelessness, you'll help end that cycle of people going from homelessness to prisons. So yeah, housing, education, health and mental health care, that's where that money should be going, and supporting people instead of supporting a flawed approach to trying to make our communities safer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Justin.
Okay, thank you.
For the NB Media Co-op, this is Arun Budathoki.